Hello and welcome to another edition of the Facts Matter podcast, courtesy of the Citizens Research Council of Michigan. I'm Guy Gordon, along with Eric Lupher. By now, you have been probably following our series on the constitutional question that's going to be presented before voters on November 3rd of this year, which is whether or not Michigan should call a constitutional convention, also known, I guess, affectionately, as a con-con. And we have slowly carved through many of the important articles. Today, we review Article 4, which basically sets up the framework for our legislature, and the president of the CRC, Eric Lupher, here to break it down for us as always. Good day to you, Eric.
Good day. We're about halfway through our series. This is the 7th of our 15 papers, so we keep plodding along.
Yeah, but this is a fascinating one because Article 4 in the legislature seems to be in the crosshairs for amendment more often than any other part of the Constitution.
It does, and I think it speaks to the idea that the people generally want to rein in the purview of the legislature to deal with a lot of things, or how the legislature acts. So they have targeted this article more than any other article. As long as we've had the ability to amend the Constitution, it also has a pretty poor batting average.
We wouldn't wish it on the Tigers.
Well, we're getting close, unfortunately.
True.
The people, even though there's subgroups of the people that say, let's do something about this and amend the Constitution one way or another, they have a hard time convincing a majority of the voters that this is a good idea.
Well, there seems to be a faction of, I guess not a throw the bums out faction, but certainly a push the bums around faction here, isn't there? They just can't seem to get to a majority.
Yeah, it's maybe a tie their hands behind their back idea, right? Let's limit what they can do and how much, again, keeping with that bums, limit how much damage they can do.
Yeah, that seems to be maybe something where there's a bit of growth in popularity. Let's line out the basics in terms of Article 4. For starters, it, I guess, lays out the size and scope of what our legislative body is going to look like.
Right. So this is the very basic. And, if you start by looking at the U.S. Constitution, Article 1 is the legislature. And we look at the Michigan Constitution before we deal with the executive or the judicial branches or local government. We here get into the legislative branch, and right away it determines the size of the body. Some state constitutions say we're going to use sort of a proportion of the people, try to keep a number of districts per 90,000, 100,000 people, something like that. Michigan in 1963 locked in that we were going to have 110 state reps and 38 state senators. Our population's grown since then. Unfortunately, not much, but
no.
The ratio of people to legislator has changed. It's also apparent when we go back and look at that 1963 Constitution that it really meant to create a part-time body. It doesn't say so.
Really?
But there are provisions in there that say dealing with immediate effect, with special legislative sessions, with the ability of the governor to pocket veto bills that have been acted, the idea of a referendum. The way all those were written, they presuppose that the body will wrap up around June 30th and go home, and there's time within the balance of the year to call a special session, or for the people to circulate petitions and call for a referendum, things like that.
I don't think most people know that. What happened on the way to efficiency and part-time?
The legislature was part-time under the 1908 Constitution, and I'd have to go back and look to see if it explicitly says so. So I suppose the con delegates in the 1961, 62 just had it in their mind that, of course, it's a part-time body and we don't need to say so. On or around 1970 or 71, all of a sudden they said, we got work to do. We're not going home on June 30th. And they just kept going and going, so that now Michigan's considered a full-time legislature, and these little provisions about special sessions or referendum just get in the way and largely are ignored, or it creates a lot of complication for how they're implemented.
And then we've got those lovely late night December lame duck sessions that have become so fraught with nonsense.
Right, and if we had those explicit statement of a part-time legislature, then a lot of that would go away.
We do see Nebraska has gone to, a unicameral legislature. Do you think that there's any desire for that?
There will be some contingent, probably some delegates that come in and say, well, let's take a hard look at Nebraska and how things work there. That is a much more agrarian state, much smaller population. Probably you would say much more uniform in political leanings. So I think it's worthwhile to look at it. In the end, having a bicameral legislature with checks and balances, not necessarily one party, I suspect will probably, hold the day, as well as ultimately what the Constitutional Convention comes up with. They have to sell to the voters in trying to get their vote on what the new Constitution is better than the 1963 Constitution, and you should vote yes. And so radical changes such as a unicameral legislature might be a step too far.
Could be. Plus, do the financial savings ever live up to the hype? Whether it's unicameral, whether it's part-time?
Yeah. In the world of looking at part-time, full-time, there's a middle ground that's sort of Michigan would certainly fall into, we call it hybrid, right? The number of session days is limited either by a certain date that they have to wrap up, or they say you have 44 session days to do your work. But that doesn't mean the legislators are going home from Lansing on July 1st necessarily, but they're going to stick around and have committee hearings and deal with constituent needs and things like that. So still you're paying staff, still you're paying legislators, even though they're not in session. The work goes on, you're just not in session, and they really, in a part-time legislature, have to condense all of the work of enacting or amending laws into a shorter amount of time.
So one of the limits that was placed on the legislature since 1963 were term limits. We revised them again in 2022. Is that the final word on it, or do you think that'd be fertile ground to plow in a con-con?
I suspect they'll want to look at it, not necessarily to get rid of it. Again, they have to sell this to the voters, that this is going to work. And I think the people have spoken on two different occasions saying that they like term limits, but you can continue to tinker around the edges with it. In 1992, we put in these lifetime limits, and the provision at that time was you had a certain amount of terms, 3 terms in the House, which would amount to 6 years, 2 terms in the Senate that would amount to 8 years. And then when we amended it in 2022, we said, well, you just get to be a legislator for 12 years, and how you decide to use that is up to you. So they might look at that and say, is 12 years too long or too short?
Yeah. Maybe a little too soon to pass judgment on that. It's been only 4 years.
Right. But yeah, I think they might tinker around the edges without throwing out the whole system.
Okay. We have heard a lot about transparency, but we've also come to expect that it ends up being a lot of lip service and not a lot of legislative action. It seems that they seem to go back and forth, with the House being aggressive in one session and then just a year later the Senate doing something, but neither teaming. Is that something at a con where advocates of greater transparency and financial disclosure could really make an impact?
Yeah, this is a tough one. So we say very early in this series, sort of pointing out what a good constitution looks like. And
Right.
we say that the provision should be concise enough to give meaning or give direction, but not so much as to be putting legislative language into the Constitution. In 2022, when we were amending term limits, we told the legislature it's time to have financial disclosure. And they took a very lackadaisical, unsubstantial way out of it. They did enact some disclosure laws, but they are relatively weak compared to other states.
Shocking, considering some of the financial scandals that we've had on both sides of the aisle over the past decade.
Yeah, again, going back to where we started, a lot of these amendments over the years have been to tie the hands behind the back. In this case, we asked the legislature to tie its own hands behind its back,
Right.
and it said, no, I don't think we want to.
Clean out your own barn.
Right. So, yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely going to be a topic of interest if there is a constitutional convention. How do you strengthen that? How do you give it more teeth? And I just wonder, can they do that without being so verbose in that sort of provision as to violate the guideposts that we would put on drafting this type of stuff?
Well, and to your point, does it even belong in the Constitution? Shouldn't they do this statutorily instead?
Yeah, right. They definitely. That's a short answer. Yes.
Yeah. You are unfailingly consistent on that. We are currently also witnessing countrywide these pitched battles over redistricting. And that could be an electric issue if we were to approve this constitutional convention.
It is certainly first and foremost an issue of the day, I think. So Michigan, when we adopted the Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission in 2018, we're following the pattern of California and Arizona before us and saying, let's take the legislature out of the process and give it back to the people and limit the amount of gerrymandering that can go on. And in doing so, we said, whatever the Federal Voting Rights Act says, we have to do that as part of our process. But now we see that the Voting Rights Act has been blown up and states are given free rein to gerrymander as much as they want. And Michigan, under this provision, is sitting on the sidelines saying this Constitution says only the Independent Citizens Redistricting Commission can do that.
Mm-hmm.
So it will be a topic of conversation if there's a con. At the same time, we are a pretty purple state, and is either party, should they control a constitutional convention, willing to throw this out, knowing that the winds of control change between the political parties and the legislature moves from Republican to Democrat? And although they might not like what they end up with in one cycle, in 2 years it might change, and now we're redistricting all over again. The idea you have to do this after every census seems to be long gone.
But they could redline that. In a con, they could say no mid-decade nonsense.
They could, yeah. But again, they have to sell it to the people, and are the people interested in being gerrymandered?
Well, Indiana was.
We don't know. Indiana's a lot more Republican state. Tennessee and Alabama, they're pretty uniform. What are the states that look pretty purple like Michigan?
Yeah.
And what sort of gerrymandering is going on there to the extent that there's any independence away from who controls the legislature at the time?
A real sore point among those that get sore over the legislature is elected officials' compensation. And there is a healthy section about that in Article 4.
Right. The 1963 Constitution was silent on this subject, but in 1968, a group of interested citizens said, well, that's a failing of the Constitution. We need to put in a provision. And they wrote it. They created what's called the State Officers Compensation Commission. And they said that whatever that commission recommends will go into effect unless the legislature votes to reject it. So that gave the legislature a pretty easy way out. Let's just not act on it, and all of a sudden we get a pay raise and able to buy bigger gifts for our kids in holiday season and so on. In 2002, the people said enough of that. We need to rein in the salary increases of the legislature, and they changed it so that whatever the commission recommends now has to be approved by an affirmative vote. You can't just stand by on the sidelines anymore. And what we've seen since then is the legislature is pretty gun shy about doing anything that seems self-aggrandizing, self-serving, and there has not been, except for minor bumps in the salaries of judges, Supreme Court justices, there hasn't been pay raises. So some among us might say, well, that's great. You should be doing your civic duty when serving in the legislature, and it's not about pay. But at the same time, we're asking citizens to take time out of their lives, to leave their day jobs and go serve for some time in the legislature. And if that means a pay cut and it means a salary, not necessarily befitting a full-time legislature, if we stick with that full-time legislature, then maybe that's a detriment. So there's no easy answer to this, but we definitely need to look at the process that's in place and see if there's a happy ground between standing by and doing nothing or having to take that affirmative vote.
Okay.
It'll certainly be an item of discussion.
I'm going to hit you with a 60-second challenge here, and we're going to put a little yellow flag, caution flag on it to say, okay, we're going a little bit into the weeds, but indulge us for a moment because we're going to be brief. What is the presentment clause, and why would we need to change it? Tick, tick, tick.
So at the end of a term, during the term, it's the job of the legislature to present the bills enacted to the governor for a signature or a veto. It has become an issue only recently. For the longest time, this was just of course. The last turnover in legislative control, the Republicans took control of the House, and bills that were enacted in the last session but not finalized, you didn't do all the legislation, legal niceties in time for the past legislature to give them to the governor, fell to the new one, and they said, well, we don't want to. And so there's a question now the state Supreme Court is trying to decide, are they compelled to? It's not a yes or no, it's of course you have to.
Mm-hmm.
Whose responsibility is that? It is really in the weeds, and but for this,
but it's
more
good that we
recent
learn a little
controversy
something here.
But for this recent controversy, nobody would ever pay attention to this.
Yeah. All right, and finally, this notion that most actions on the part of the legislature, if not tied to an appropriation, can be subject to a citizen referendum or a vote of the people. And since its creation, we have seen some pretty significant pretzeling and gymnastics done to try to bring appropriations into the question so that they can avoid a referendum and to some extent avoid accountability.
Right. So the idea, the referendum, the idea that people can say, I don't like what the legislature did, let's circulate petitions calling for a vote and let the people decide if that's a good idea or not. And they said, well, we can't do that for an appropriation, right? The idea that the state appropriates money to run the departments and fund universities and fund schools, everything else. If we subject that to a referendum, the whole system would break down and we couldn't function as a state government.
True.
And then what happens is that some creative legislator said, well, okay, I have this controversial bill that I want to push through that probably somebody's going to get upset about and might want a referendum. What if I tuck $100 or $1,000 or something and call it for implementation or for some other
Expenses.
part of it? And now all of a sudden it's not subject to referendum, really contrary to the intent of that provision. But the
Absolutely.
courts have winked and nodded and let that go along. If we were to have a con and they did one thing and addressed that, it would be a successful con. They need to clean that up and return it to its intent.
Yeah, that is one of those where it's so ripe for reform, and sad that it has to be done and is distorted so much.
Yeah,
Um,
it could be done by amendment, but who's going to champion it? Who's really going to take that up? It's not in the legislature's interest to put that out there and get that fixed. So the people would need to do it, but who's going to do it?
All right. Any final thoughts? That's well covered.
Yeah, I mean, the legislative branch, there's a lot of what you would expect, and just this is the job of the legislature and how they should go about their business. But clearly there's some well, maybe not controversial. There's some issues that the people might want to really pay attention to and think about how they could change the structuring, the functioning of our state government and the policy making.
And maybe a con is the way you get that batting average up.
It's all or nothing.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. All right, Eric, thanks very much. And we might want to remind people that we just celebrated a very significant anniversary of the Citizens Research Council of Michigan. And we are certainly not putting our hand out, but we're smiling and asking if people would like to support.
Yes, we're getting a lot of positive feedback for this con series, that it's very helpful for people to think about this vote, but also better understand how their state government works. And if they can support us in our work to do this type of stuff and other projects that we're undertaking during the year, it'd be very helpful keeping the Research Council sustainable and going for the next 110 years.
All right. We'll be there for you.
All right.
All right. Eric Lupher, thanks so much. That's it for our Article 4 review, and we will be back with more on the Facts Matter podcast to wrap up our con review in future weeks. Take care.
The Citizens Research Council of Michigan has been providing lawmakers, academics, the media, philanthropists, business leaders, voters, and all Michiganders with factual, unbiased, independent information on significant issues concerning state and local government organization and finance. For over a century, our research is available to you. Go online at crcmich.org and on all the social media platforms, Twitter, Blue Sky, Facebook, Instagram, LinkedIn, and download our research. Check out our numerous papers and blogs and listen to our podcasts. And while you're there, please consider supporting our research with a donation. This has been a Facts Matter podcast, a presentation of the Citizens Research Council of Michigan.